There are two accounts at the French Treasury in Paris that hold billions of dollars belonging to 14 different African nations. For 75 years, the rule was absolute. 50% of everything these countries earned from exporting oil, gold, and uranium never reached their own central banks. It flowed directly into accounts managed by the French government. And while recent reforms in West Africa officially ended that deposit requirement on paper, the architecture hasn't actually moved. For the 6 nations in Central Africa, the 50% rule remains untouched. For the rest, the eco-replacement currency is stalled past 2027. The wealth of a continent stays exactly where the system designed it to be, under European oversight. To understand how that's possible, you have to look at the fine print of a system called the CFA franc. 14 sovereign nations, their own governments, their own borders, their own flags, operate inside exactly that arrangement. It's a monetary bloc that spans from the forests of Senegal to the oil fields of Gabon, divided into 2 regional zones, 8 nations in West Africa and 6 in the center. Together, they form a financial territory larger than the European Union, all tethered to a single desk in Paris. The system is built on a promise of stability, but that promise has a price, and the price is the right to run your own economy. The CFA franc gives 14 nations a fixed exchange rate, 655.957 CFA to €1 exactly. And France guarantees that rate is convertible, meaning if you hold CFA francs, you can always exchange them. No currency collapse, no hyperinflation spiral. In a region where neighboring countries have watched their currencies lose half their value overnight, that promise is not nothing. But to get that guarantee, these countries historically had to deposit 50% of their foreign reserves into an account at the French Treasury, not their own central bank, Paris. Think about what that means in plain terms. You earn money from your exports, cocoa, oil, uranium, and half of those earnings sit in an account you don't fully control, managed under rules you didn't write. It's a security deposit that never gets returned. That account is called the operations account. And it's not just a storage mechanism, it's a pressure gauge. If the account goes negative, it triggers automatic overdraft facilities. But those facilities come with conditions, oversight, and effective veto power over monetary decisions. The IMF's own 1963 explainer called it a safety valve. Critics would call it a leash. Then add the governance layer. French representatives sat on the boards of both regional central banks, the BCEAO covering West Africa, the BEAC covering Central Africa. Key decisions required unanimity. In practice, that means one French representative could block monetary policy. That's not a partnership. That's veto power dressed in institutional language. And then there's the peg itself. A fixed rate to the euro means these nations cannot devalue their currency to make their exports more competitive. Their raw materials get priced in a currency calibrated for European trade flows, not for building African industry. The result is visible in the data. Manufacturing sits below 10% of GDP in most CFA nations. In non-CFA African peers, it's above 20%. So here's how to frame this carefully and honestly. What we can prove is the rules. A fixed peg, a reserve deposit requirement, a governance structure with French oversight baked in. What we can infer is the impact. Constrained monetary policy, suppressed credit, limited industrialization. What we cannot claim is that the CFA alone caused poverty. Geography, governance, commodity cycles, they all matter. But the constraint system doesn't just limit options, it amplifies every other weakness. On January 12, 1994, the stability machine broke. Overnight, the CFA franc lost 50% of its value, not gradually, not with a warning. One day, your savings were worth something. The next day, they were worth half. Prices for food, medicine, and imported goods doubled in 24 hours for millions of people who had been told, repeatedly, officially, that their currency was guaranteed. So what happened? The peg had been overvaluing the CFA for years. That made imports cheap and exports uncompetitive. The pressure built slowly, invisibly, right up until it couldn't. And when it finally broke, it didn't ease. It collapsed. That's the core paradox of the stability machine. It doesn't smooth out shocks, it stores them, and then it releases everything at once. The people who paid the price weren't the institutions that designed the system. They were the farmers, the traders, the families who had no hedge, no dollar account, no way out. Stability, it turned out, was a promise with an asterisk. But here's what makes this story deeper than one bad year. Because some countries saw this coming decades earlier. And when they tried to leave, the response told you everything about how seriously currency independence was treated. Mali was the first real test case. In June 1962, President Modibo Keïta stood before the National Assembly and described national money as a guarantee of freedom and an instrument of power. 2 years into independence, he wanted the real thing. On July 1st, Mali left the CFA franc and introduced the Malian franc, printed in Czechoslovakia, set at parity with the CFA, framed as a sovereign right under the Franco-Malian agreements. Within 3 weeks, traders in Bamako were protesting near the French embassy. The chant, "Down with the Malian franc, long live de Gaulle." The fear was immediate. Import prices were going to rise, and landlocked Mali had no buffer. The Malian franc faced 2 devaluations in 1963 and 1967 that halved its value against the CFA. Trade barriers went up from CFA neighbors. Economic isolation compounded everything. By 1984, after 22 years, Mali returned to the CFA zone at a rate of 2 Malian francs to 1 CFA. The sovereignty experiment ended by handing back the keys. The lesson isn't that monetary independence is impossible. It's that it's extremely expensive if the institutional foundations aren't in place. But the question the system never answers, and never has to answer, is who decides when a country is ready. That gate has no published criteria. Guinea learned an even harder version of that lesson. In 1958, Guinea voted no to the French community and declared full independence. France responded by pulling out infrastructure, technicians, and, by most accounts, the contents of government buildings, even ripping the light bulbs out of the sockets and smashing the windows on their way out. The rupture was immediate and deliberate. And then came Operation Persil. Between 1959 and 1960, French intelligence, the SDECE, produced large quantities of counterfeit Guinean francs and flooded the economy with them. The explicit goal was to trigger inflation, destabilize the new government's finances, and collapse its credibility before it could demonstrate that independence actually worked. It was a tactic lifted directly from the Nazi Germany playbook, specifically Operation Bernhard, which used counterfeit British pounds as economic warfare during World War II. France chose the same tool against a newly independent African nation. The operation was exposed in May 1960 when Senegalese authorities intercepted a weapons shipment tied to the broader destabilization effort. The scandal became public. France stepped back. But the economic damage was already done, and the message had already been sent. We need to be careful about what this proves. Operation Persil is not evidence that France controls every CFA nation today through covert sabotage. What it is evidence of is how high the stakes were treated. Currency independence wasn't viewed as a policy disagreement. It was treated as a threat serious enough to justify economic warfare. 60 years later, that sensitivity hadn't faded. The system's skin is just as thin today as it was during the Cold War. You can see it in what happened in Dakar in 2017. A man named Kemi Seba stood outside the BCEAO headquarters and burned a single 5,000 CFA franc note. The central bank filed a criminal complaint. He was arrested, then acquitted on a technicality. Senegal's law punishes destroying banknotes plural, not a single note. Then he was expelled from the country. One note. That's how sensitive the system still is to symbolic dissent. Which means this is not just a colonial legacy story. It is a live financial architecture, and you can see it in the capital flows. External debt flows in, capital flows out, and the CFA's free convertibility makes the exit door very easy to find. The African Economic Research Consortium conducted a forensic audit of 15 franc zone countries over a 40-year window, and the results describe a sieve, not an economy. For every $1 these nations borrowed from abroad, 96 cents immediately rotated back out as capital flight, into foreign accounts, into offshore holdings, into the financial systems of the very countries those loans came from. Over 4 decades, that adds up to roughly $86 billion, approximately 122% of the region's entire GDP, around 5 times total domestic investment over the same period. You borrow to develop, and the money leaves. That's not a market failure. That's a structural leak baked into the system design. And that leak compounds directly into the credit problem. Credit to GDP ratios in CFA countries run between 13 and 25%. Compare that to regional peers like Nigeria or South Africa, where that ratio sits above 50%. What that means in practice is that a business owner in Dakar or Douala operates in a credit environment roughly half as deep as their peers outside the zone. You can't borrow to scale. You can't industrialize without capital. You can't build manufacturing capacity on a 13% credit ratio. Which brings us back to that manufacturing number. Below 10% of GDP inside the CFA zone, above 20% in non-CFA African peers. The fixed peg makes their exports structurally expensive against European imports flooding local markets. Raw materials go out, finished goods come in, and the gap between those two flows is exactly where industrialization was supposed to happen. None of this is the CFA alone. Governance matters, geography matters, commodity dependence matters. But the constraint system doesn't sit alongside those problems. It amplifies them. And it dampens every attempt to build enough momentum to escape them. The system isn't static. It's under pressure along 3 active fault lines. In West Africa, the ECO is the official exit ramp, but it's been stalled past 2027, leaving the old architecture in place under a new name. The 2019 reforms removed the deposit requirement and French board seats on paper, but the currency hasn't launched and the credit ratios haven't moved. In Central Africa, the 1945 rules haven't shifted an inch. French board representation, reserve obligations, the same governance structure, untouched, and almost nobody is talking about it. And in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the political exit from French military and institutional influence has already happened. The open question is whether monetary policy follows, or stays frozen while everything else shifts around it. That's the gap the system depends on. The peg sits exactly where it always has. The surface story says these nations have a stability guarantee. The structure underneath says they have a ceiling. That ceiling was always the point. Understand who set it.